966.
We are pleased to welcome back onto the 966 Princess Mashael bint Saud Al Shalan, and welcoming onto the 966 for the first time, hopefully of many, Princess Noura bint Turki Al Saud, founding partner of AEON Strategy and co-founder of AEON Collective. You're both co-founders of AEON Strategy and AEON Collective. Welcome back, Princess Mashael, and welcome on, Princess Noura. Nice to see you both.
Good to see you guys. I know, Richard, you were in our offices how long was it? Honestly,
probably 3 weeks now. It seems like ages, doesn't it?
It feels like an eternity. Yeah. But, hopefully next time, Lucian, you can make your way over to the office.
Inshallah.
I had a great drink while I was there. I was noticing you have your afternoon energy smoothie, which is great. But and we had an opportunity before we did the official intro to talk a little bit about how you two connected, and so we'll splice that in. But before we move on to sort of the heart of it, and the COP28, can you talk a little bit about your headquarters? Because we were complimenting on your website. We just discovered that you two did the website. The website is, just astoundingly good.
It's awesome. Yeah.
Your headquarters, you both designed, and it's quite a departure. It's a really lovely space with great light. Anyway, can you talk a little bit about that, and also your tree garden, which or what, I'm not sure what the proper term is.
It's the tree library, yeah.
Tree library. Just briefly on your space that you developed and built.
Yeah, I think to both Noura and I, when we first started, we knew that the topics that we were handling were so heavy and sometimes so complex that we wanted to create a space that almost served as a haven where you wanted to go to every day and sort of design to your temperament and sort of feel like a second home. The bulk of what we get from statistics is that people spend most of their time in their offices, but what we're seeing is really dehumanized cubes that are mostly painted white. Actually, to point to the green itself took some time of Noura and I sitting in the middle of the half-built offices, mixing colors to just get it to the exact shade that we wanted to have this space with. So if it is telling of anything, that we're very much meticulous on the detail. We want to make sure that we're creating the right kind of space for like-minded individuals to crowd in, because we're, I guess, painfully aware of the size of the task at hand and responsibility that we decided to undertake in day one, which was sustainable development, right? And before you sustain, you need to be doing a lot of repair to get it to a space that was safe enough for us to continue to sustain. So it's, let's say, the heaviness of the topic that we have at hand that almost forced us to do all of these additional layers of creating the space. And it definitely helps when you have a partner that's an amateur designer / architect that gets to sketch up all of the ideas that you're discussing into paper and help put the idea forth. I don't know, Noura, what was it?
No, I think it's very well. I think just like any startup, we started in a living room. We came back and we started, developing our ideas, working on smaller projects here and there, but it was all done from our living room until we hired employee number one, who is very much part of the development and a superstar, and we're so happy. We're so lucky to have her. And she
should have a shout out, shouldn't he? This is Miyad.
Oh, Miyad Abdullah.
Miyad is the best.
Yeah. So we would shout out to Miyad.
Absolutely. She was employee number one. She's literally the backbone of this entire institution. And we thank her for all her hard work and her commitment and, just her friendship. And she used to come in and out, joining us in this living room, just sketching, ideating, planning, until we decided that we need to have, something more presentable to meet people, right? And to have meetings and all of that. So we went around looking for office spaces all over the city, and we couldn't find anything. Every office space after the other was just depressing, and just, I don't know, it just ripped all of the enthusiasm, all of the excitement out of what we had in mind. And so we just decided, you know what, we've been in this living room for quite a while. Might as well just stick for another few months and build something. There was an empty plot of land that we were able to use, and it was given to us. And we were like, okay, you know what, let's just build something that's inviting, that's spacious, that brings in light, that's conducive to creativity and let's just do it. So we started working on it, and it's a work in progress. We constantly expand, work, improve.
It's a living organism on its own.
Especially with the tree library. Can you briefly tell us about the tree library, which is a beautiful space that you're going to try and replicate throughout various spots in the kingdom, correct?
Absolutely, in the kingdom and in the world, because of the density of the topics that we're trying to handle. It required a bit of airtime for people to sit and converse around some difficult conversations. At the stage with which we were ideating around this issue, we were discussing some topics that were quite controversial at the time, like net zero or carbon markets, or things that back in 2019, I know it's a completely different world today, but it might seem really controversial to discuss in Saudi. So we wanted to create a safe space that allowed people to have these conversations. Maybe if you allow us for another shout out, we had a brilliant friend and a colleague and architect,
an
actual architect. It's not Noura's.
We're not actually podcasters either.
Yeah,
we know how this works.
So it's a group of posers just project a message to people. But yeah, Alia was brilliant, and we were like, Alia, we need to have a home that sort of reproduced the feeling at its purest of safety that I missed at the time that we were coming up with these ideas of losing my grandmother. Having a garden and what it meant in a place like Riyadh used to always mean something that was productive, that was intimate, that allowed people to gather. And we saw and witnessed over our own lifetime how that is morphed into something that it should have never become, a space where it was a representation of people's egos, the types of flowers, the most a la mode tree that you can import from God knows where, and with it maybe the unintended implications. So we wanted to create a space that was true to that notion of an open air majlis where you can air out a lot of these difficult conversations and surround people with this concept of a paradise garden, going into a place that brings on your ego to the, dial it up to close to zero, but also raise up your innovation and your openness and receptiveness to ideas and to the other, and be surrounded by, at its simplest form, a fruit that you can grab and just sit and roll up your sleeves and start discussing some of these more difficult conversations, and have that be sort of the seedling through which you can have a much greater impact on the world around you. So that was essentially the inception behind it. And obviously we saw that this type of interaction was very much needed, especially post-COVID, that there was a real wish and a desire to connect in real life other than having a global mesh that's a bit more digital. And that's what we're trying to create right now with the Tree Library program.
Well, it's a beautiful space, and I think it has every indigenous tree in Saudi included in it. And I also
89, if I'm not mistaken, and growing.
So let's dive into COP28, from which you recently returned. I mean, this was the largest UN climate summit ever. This is in Dubai, 85,000 delegates, 154 heads of state. It must have been a bit of a zoo, but it must have been awfully impressive as well. Can you talk a little bit about being there, and then let's just flow on into some of the, over 170 declarations came out of this, declarations, pledges, commitments, some of them more meaningful than others, some of them more achievable than others. But if you can talk about the experience and then your assessment of the big things and the really notable things that you want to put a pin in and say, pay attention to this.
If I could maybe set the stage a little bit around the COP itself. To us, these are like Super Bowls. It's like the end of year culmination of a year's work, and for you to get a sense of what have we done, what we have achieved, and how can we use this as a springboard for future action. So we were looking at this more in terms of a typical COP. Maybe there were a lot of promises that were being baked into it, but I have to say, even from our perspective and in our last conversation, we were thinking that there might be some massive achievements that could be done, but maybe not necessarily to the degree that we were hoping to see. And I'm really happy to say that, maybe we'll get back to it a bit later, that it defied all of our expectations. But at its core, it was becoming what COPs need to be from this point moving forward. In the beginning, they were very tight negotiations between different countries and different countries' representatives to get all of the countries around the world to agree on one set of rules. which culminated in what became the Paris Agreement, right? So it was essentially just saying that was our first COP, by the way. So let's sit on a table and let's all agree that this would be our pathway and our rule book to get us from point A to point B. A being a very unsafe operating space for humanity, to B, a safer, arguably, space for operation, which was around the targets of the 1.5 to 2 degrees C. What has happened between COP21 in Paris and between now was that it was naturally starting to close up a lot of the areas of negotiations, a lot of the issues around carbon markets, a lot of the issues around, let's say, the rules of the game, let's say. And now that we have a pretty solid rule book, it's only natural to start crowding even more people in, to start thinking about the rollout or the execution or the solution. So it was not, in my opinion, an exercise of fanfare. It was almost like what a natural evolution of a COP needed to be, to allow us to achieve the intended goals and targets of the Paris Agreement, which essentially said we need all of the players on the table. We need the replication of what an actual ecosystem looks like, not just for negotiators, the business sector, the private sector, NGOs, civil society, youth, everyone that has a role to play within this bigger arena, to get them going on that translation piece and to get the momentum going on pieces around finance, on what has worked and what hasn't, on maybe having even more way of influencing what those policies are looking like, to be more in step with reality and the needs that reality is dictating.
Maybe just to say why this COP was important, and we touched on this earlier about the global stocktake and what the global stocktake is. Chal, you mentioned Paris and how significant Paris was in terms of driving climate action, because it crowded it in people from different sectors within society, and not only the official UNFCCC track or negotiation track. And essentially, the reason why this COP was very important, because it looked at what happened since 2015 to today, and all the commitments and promises, and where we are today, where we stand, and what is necessary to do from now, and not just agree on paper, but actual actions that we need to take today in order to stay below 2 degrees by end of the century. And a big aspect around this was on managing emissions by 2050 and reaching net zero targets globally by 2050. And this was a point of contention and since the get-go. One thing that the presidency has done this year was it literally was very transparent, and it opened up the options in the text for all 197, arguably maybe up to 200 countries to come in with their text and to come in with their demands and their aspirations and what they wanted to see in this text and what they wanted to see come out of the agreement. So it was open for people to come in with all of, whether you agree or don't. You're clearly going to see a lot of countries disagreeing about topics, but I think the most contentious was on the phase out and phase down of fossil fuels. And there were the way countries are organized in blocks for them to have more of a presence and a stronger voice. So you have the High Coalition or High Ambition Coalition that was really pushing for this phase out of fossil fuels. And then you had the EU, for example, talking about a phase down, and their conversations kind of evolved over the year. Other countries talking about, no, we want to insert the concept or text around unabated fossil fuels, so using carbon capture technologies for that. But essentially, it all revolved around the energy mix and the role of fossil fuels in the global energy mix and its contribution to climate change. So that, I think, was the most important point of conversation.
I think as well, going into it, what the UAE was very sober in recognitions that you needed very clear wins that helped bridge that crisis of trust that was happening between different countries. And, going into it, maybe what we're hearing in terms of the noise externally was still reflecting into the positions of different negotiators, especially around some of the aspects of the loss and damage fund that was announced during COP27 that had a bit of a contention around its structure. Where does it get housed? Is it going to be under the World Bank, etc.? So what the UAE was able to achieve in the first hours actually was to say, case closed, congratulations, let's all celebrate this win that could have been a stickler, that could have hindered a lot of other wins somewhere down the line. And then followed it up with relatively easy, arguably, agreements that could have all of the different players on the same page, such as tripling of renewables. So instead of focusing on the denser, contentious issues around phasing out, phasing down, things that are more tied to creating two different camps. Let's all agree on what we all need to do, right? So tripling of renewables, everyone wants more renewables. This is something easy to agree on. Doubling of energy efficiency, absolutely, let's have more of that. Some of the agreements as well that were emerging on some of the areas, let's say, that were very little or seldom touched in the past under a climate umbrella. So some of the agreements around agriculture, for example, it just allowed for a much wider lens and a bigger momentum building exercise that allowed to people for countries to say, these are the areas that we agree on, these are the commitments that we're making in these spaces, and let's have a positive momentum and trajectory going into the second week, which tends to be the stickier negotiation side of the COP.
Yeah, I think a lot of the issues that could have been resolved early on were kind of discussed in the first week or even first days.
Yeah.
But we did see that brought people together, and it kind of pushed them in the right direction in terms of everyone on, even if there were areas where there were disagreement, everyone wanted to find a solution.
Yeah.
And I think the events of the first couple of days really put people on that pathway, and brought them together as opposed to push them apart. And I think that was brilliant by the presidency.
I agree.
As a non-Annex 1 country under the UNFCCC, which is a developing country, the UAE was not supposed to put any, and it's not required to put any money in the loss and damage fund because it's categorized as a non-Annex 1 country. But it did. It did because out of goodwill, because it has the funding, it has the capacity, and it wanted to encourage and crowd in funding there. Are we at the level that is required? Nowhere near. It's about, I think it reached somewhere just north of 700 million, and what's really needed for this fund is more than trillions, like hundreds of trillions. But it's a good step.
Let me jump in here because I think that's interesting. Because Princess Mashael, you and we talked about your concerns going into it about how it was being portrayed in the media, and concerns that it was sort of being set up to fail. So this is very interesting. You point to two things. One, you felt like more constituencies were represented, had a voice. Two, I think that was interesting terms. You said very clear wins early on, and maintaining momentum. So it's interesting. So is it, how you manage a group like this, and it's
Can I add a third one to that, Richard?
Absolutely.
This is the projection of soft diplomacy in a way. It's food. When people have good food, good coffee, comfortable spaces, gardens, spaces to breathe, art, music, these are tangential things that usually are in the peripheries of COPs or sometimes non-existent. So when people are well-fed, rested, comfortable, listening to good things, breathing good air, it's conducive to create this sense of, we are one tribe and there to solve for it.
By the way, just to add to that, if you speak to anyone who worked on getting the Paris Agreement to work from the presidency, obviously they did a lot of shuttle diplomacy, they did a lot of work, but one big aspect of the event itself was really focusing on the availability of food and coffee, and good food and coffee, and this was conducive to the success because people are working overnight. They're starved of good food. So it might sound as something secondary, and because it's secondary, people don't often think about it, but it does play a big role in having people, comfortable.
Well, that's a human exercise. But apropos to that is this was held, and while we were over there, Lucia and I were laughing because we do a daily news review, and we couldn't keep up because so much was happening. Because the announcement that Saudi Arabia had won the 2030 Expo, which was huge. The reason I say this is because wasn't this event, the COP20 event, held at the Expo 2020 site that, the Emirates and Dubai, had so successfully executed just in 2022. And so it was on that site, correct?
Absolutely.
Yes.
I mean, arguably that was to some in early days to its detriment, just so large. Different countries were housed in spaces that were akin to meeting blocks. It just made it very difficult because those that are used to COPs, they're used to all of the countries' pavilions happening under one roof. So walk down, you'd get a sense of, this conversation is happening there, this event is happening there, let me just walk over. But given the massive space of Expo, it made it a lot more difficult. But honestly, I saw an adjustment period where in the first few days, well, a good co-benefit is my stamina is really up there at this stage. I have to keep it up now.
Your cardio is awesome right now.
Yeah, absolutely, because we had to run from one space to the other. But I don't know if that was equally done by design or let's say as a positive co-benefit, because sometimes when you aggregate like-minded thinkers too closely to one another, it could end up creating chokeholds or spaces that would make some of the aspects of the conversation a little bit more difficult. So yeah, I think probably there are a lot of PhD students that are now writing up papers around the design of COP and how that has had effects on the outcomes. But there's definitely something to draw from just having a wide space for people to breathe and just enjoy. And there's definitely, in addition to a lot of the other COPs, let's say a leg up, the infrastructure that was already out there because of Expo.
Fascinating. So let's start. So, it looks like a great first week. And certainly from the announcement coming out, very rolling. But as it turned out, COP28 had to be extended a day to reach an agreement. Can you tell us essentially about the second week, which is in a lot of that, I guess we're talking about the global stock take. And
I think that's where you lose the parallel of sports, right? When I'm talking about a Super Bowl, I've never heard of one that extends by a few days. But when you choose to go into this profession, you have to know going overboard by 24 hours is akin to normal. It's not that deal. We're just happy and glad that it didn't stretch beyond a 3-day threshold. And honestly, up to the last 2 days or maybe a day and a half, it was seemingly heading into a roadblock that no one thought that they might find some way out of. And maybe we can dig in a bit deeper around some of the political diplomatic magic that some of the ministers were weaving in the backdrop to allow us to reach what became the UAE consensus.
Please give us that context, because it's the UAE consensus is considered a monument, a momentous historical agreement. And what is the UAE consensus, and tell us a little bit how it was achieved?
So I think Noura reflected a little bit on this a bit earlier around the global stock take and what was deemed even prior to going into COP, the moment that the UAE was announced as spearheading the presidency, at the wake of COP27, is that any language that does not clearly delineate a phase out or at minimum a phase down of fossil fuels will be seen as a massive failure. I think the massive diplomatic breakthrough came when a decision was made to focus less on the sources and focus more on the trajectory. So instead of thinking of phasing down or phasing out of fossil fuels, more of a question of what are you really trying to achieve at the end of the day? And instead of equally delineating emissions, any words that were rife with diplomatic sticky points were removed off of the table, and more of a focus and an emphasis was made around what's the intentionality and what are we really trying to achieve. At the end of the day, what are we really trying to achieve with the global stocktake is to ensure that we keep 1.5 alive, is to ensure that we're aligning a lot of these goals and trajectories with scientific goal and target and based on science, let's say. In terms of its trajectory to developing countries is to assure some kind of an open-ended menu that allowed countries to have a differentiated pathway to reach these intended goals and targets. In some of the early text, there was some mention around trying to rebalance the issues of the demand for oil and gas and the supply of oil and gas. That was language that we saw removed at the end of it. I think the key outcome to me was there was a document that no one was happy with in its early wake, that everyone had to make a little bit of sacrifices to assure that what we're agreeing on is much stronger than what we're disagreeing on, and that we could all contribute or minimize our requirements to a certain threshold to allow for an agreement to emerge.
Yeah, I think it's just the nature of negotiations, right? Everyone gets something, but no one gets everything, simply put, right? And I think so just maybe to take a couple of steps backwards, the UAE consensus was specifically on the global stocktake and the agreement on the global stocktake, which is one agenda item of many. There are multiple items, as you probably know, but there's, agendas on adaptation, finance, market mechanisms, all of these different components that fall under either the Paris Agreement or the meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol. So there are different agenda items, but again, because based on what I explained earlier, the biggest item was the global stocktake because it's, the culmination of what happened until from 2015 until today, and that's why it was a big issue and the main agenda item for this COP. And the failure of that means ultimately, it would be seen as a failure of COP, even though there could be a lot of other progress on other items. But this was the big ticket issue, and that's why there was a lot of focus on that. But there were, of course, other agenda items that were discussed and that was improved, or there was progress on many of them.
I think an important phrase that I believe I forgot to mention, so I'll just jump back into it. An important framing that I thought was really successful is instead of saying phase out or phase down, let's agree on a different language, which was transition away from, right? So if you're talking about phasing something down, you're talking about a supply of something within a system, which could create some kind of different tribes retreating to the areas they were comfortable with or uncomfortable with, for that matter, and giving very little room to negotiate. But when you're talking about transition away from, there are some aspects of transitioning away from fossil fuels that's already happening today. It's happening organically. There are differentiated sets of endowments for different countries that may choose to continue to provide, let's say, the last barrel of oil in certain spaces because of their the cost that it would cost them to produce that barrel of oil, or the associated emissions at the wellhead that can give them a differentiated advantage, let's say, that allowed them to continue to play, as long as, again, we're agreeing on the end goal. Do we need fossil fuels and energy systems overall to produce electricity? I think the answer universally is no. Do we need fossil fuels to do some of the more difficult things up to a certain extent? The answer almost universally is yes, primarily on some of what's called the hard to abate sector. And I think when you're giving a certain directionality, but you're also saying that within that, we're giving equal treatment to the way with which we're assessing that pathway, we're giving equal treatment to having a broad opening up of the items within the menu. So if you noticed in the global stocktakes text, there was a clear mention of renewables, of energy efficiency, of clean hydrogen, as opposed to solely a focus on green, which again, is the bracket on CCUS that a lot of countries are emphasizing quite heavily. And why was it so important to mention these specific areas? Is to highlight and to send a clear signal to the market that these are areas that we are intending to focus on quite heavily. At the same time, when you're saying transition away from fossil fuels, this is sending two differentiated signals to two differentiated audiences. So if you're in countries that are not oil producing, you're sending a signal that to us, we're going to be focusing quite heavily on renewables. We're going to be focusing on very clear areas of independence, of reliance on any external countries. And that, again, falls within their global narrative. So countries like Europe, countries like some of the blocs that are more emphasizing on the high coalition or the high ambitions, like low-lying countries and islands, might be focused quite heavily on that type of term. But if you're thinking about the Middle East, countries, primarily the GCC, countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, sending a differentiated signal to say, concepts that are akin to the circular carbon economy are no longer a nice to have, or are no longer meant to be vehicles to help us achieve net zero by 2060. The whole world has now committed to net zero by 2050. And there are clear closing window of opportunity, let's say, for you to figure out a way of differentiating your product from a carbon management perspective compared to the rest of the world. So if you're aiming to continue to provide that barrel, or if you're aiming to continue to provide that product to the market. You have to have a clear distinction in how you're approaching the emissions associated with your product. So it just allowed for different softer landing zones for different countries, and allowed for a language that was both stringent, that was both science-based, but equally open to the differentiated sets of endowments that countries had going into this process. I mean, some are saying it just revived the whole spirit of the Paris Agreement, which is, everyone has a role to play, basically.
Well, it does, but also it seems, since the 2015 COP21 Paris Agreement, each successive COP has tried to move closer to more ironclad commitments. Let's get a little more specific and really ironclad commitments. And there's criticism of this in some sense. That is it still too open-ended, or what's your takeaway? Or did you feel like there was really significant movement in people, right? These are specific commitments, and that nations are going to be pursuing, trying to fulfill these commitments?
They would have to, because I think the differentiation is that when you're saying ironclad, do you mean prescriptive in what that pathway looked like, or do you mean ironclad in terms of the commitments? If it is ironclad, in my opinion, then the focus would have been diverted to emissions. The focus would have been in ensuring that we're not falling into mistakes in the future when it might be a little bit too late to say, go down one pathway or another. I mean, I was chatting with Noura a bit earlier around, without naming names, the issue of adaptation, for example, and how we were told this false narrative of do not mention adaptation, focus on mitigation, because the more that you focus on adaptation, you're steering people away from mitigation. That's really important. And the reality of the matter is now you're having people at some of these frontline hit areas, be it being hit by hurricanes, sea level rise, that have no means of achieving their intended goals and targets.
No, absolutely. I think especially when it comes to adaptation, I think it was always seen as a non-economically viable approach, and you had to do it just for the sake of adapting. But I think the conversation has changed, and there's a lot more highlighting the benefits of adapting, not to mention the importance of saving lives, of course. But again, there's a lot more incentives for the private sector to invest in adaptation methodologies or adaptation measures as opposed to only mitigation. To give you an example, if you're looking at farmers and you want to enhance their crops resilient, investing in a heat resilient crop is there's an economic benefit for investing in that as opposed to not, and that's considered climate adaptation finance. So that's just one example, but yeah.
As with everything, it seems, the loss and damage agreement, the adaptation, it comes down in many ways to money. And how much was committed in terms of the loss and damage? I know we have that $100 billion mark, but also the adaptation needs funding. Yep. And is it your sense that the funding is going to be forthcoming and adequate?
So this is the thing, even with some of the commitments on tripling renewables and energy efficiency that was under the global stocktake agenda, none of these can be operationalized unless you have the financing to support it, whether it's on the adaptation or mitigation. There's still a huge gap when it comes to the adaptation component and also the loss and damage. The loss and damage, again, the fund currently receives 700 million, and I think it requires billion. Same thing for adaptation finance. There was I think it was about 20 billion or something last year in Glasgow, and there was a call to double that. But the current gap in adaptation finance ranges between 190 something billion to 370 billion. That's a huge gap. And again, the reason why this range varies is because it depends on what constitutes as adaptation finance and whatnot. But still 194 or 5 is still significant in terms of a billion, in terms of a gap. Yeah, so there's a lot. And I think one of the, the agreement on the global stocktake, I think, was successful. But without the finances that are required, it's very hard to move forward. And this is some of the concerns that many of the low-lying islands, the IOSIS group, had, because it doesn't matter what goals you have on paper. If you don't have the mechanisms that will allow for these goals to happen on the ground, then you're stuck in that same loop and system where you're constantly calling year after year for more finances and nothing is happening, or you're just getting peanuts compared to the amount that you need. Now, this might sound very gloomy, but I think one must acknowledge the progress and the conversations happening around reinventing the international financial system, restructuring debt finance and all of that in order to support the climate targets in a way that is fitting to today's environment and the amount of finances that are required.
Yeah, I think that's what was sent as a very clear signal, and honestly, maybe arguably some of the failures. If you notice the agenda items that were never pushed across the finish line, a lot of them, in spite of the loss and damage fund being, agreed upon very early in the process, a lot of the funding and financing, if you're comparing it to what's really needed, it's peanuts. Vaclav Smil reminded us a while ago, the differentiation between actually getting to the moon and back and between where we're at with climate. And the reason why we're able to do that all the way back in the 60s and not being able to get our heads remotely around the climate crisis is that what that required was billions. And what we're talking about right now is trillions. And trillions maybe in some ways with very little to be seen from a tangible, bankable impact, let alone the complexities of the shifting geopolitical map with this task at hand. So what it's really sent us is a very clear signal that required further attention, not to mention Article 6, some of the issues around the carbon markets that were not finalized, but also that there needs to be a sober reassessment of what needs to happen within our general financial architecture to allow for this consistent crowding in of funding to the areas that need it the most, and in a way that's consistent with our goals and targets. The global stocktake, as I was saying on the sidelines of this, is sending a very clear signal to what each country must do, but it's not sending a very clear signal to what the financial ecosystem must do. If we're looking at all of the NDCs globally, there's very little to see financial commitments that are being committed to on paper to what those countries need to be on the receiving end of. That was one of the more painful moments to both Noura and I, witnessing that last celebratory moment, to see the raising of the hand of our colleague from Samoa, knowing that she had to have the very difficult task of going back to her people, not having very clear outcomes that were generated. So that's why a massive emphasis on adaptation and on finance will go into COP next year, COP29, and in the lead up to COP30 in Brazil. And the Brazilians were taking a leadership position, saying that we need a troika between the UAE, Azerbaijan, and that will be hosting COP next year, and Brazil, to help shepherd that issue of adaptation among many other issues that are left hanging. Because, that's what we really need to get down to. It's all nice to have a cool document that everyone agrees on, but we need to do more of walking the talk to enable us to get to where we need to go.
And for our listeners, can you tell us what NDC stands for?
Sure. So that's nationally determined contributions. The way that the Paris Agreement magic wand or secret sauce is to say, instead of how Kyoto functioned, which was the previous agreement that sort of split the globe into global north versus global south, what Paris was really successful in doing is to say each country can determine what its contribution to this goal and target is. And then with this ratchet mechanism, this 5-year cyclical ratchet mechanism, be able to submit more ambitious goals and targets at these periods of time to help us achieve those goals. So it's almost like you're building up confidence by doing, as opposed to just making really vague commitments that you can renege from somewhere down the line.
Yeah.
And it's been working.
So called the intended INDCs, so intended nationally determined contribution pre-Paris Agreement. So when everyone agreed, it moved into, and the term changed into nationally determined contributions, which every few years countries update their NDCs. You probably heard about this, that countries update their NDCs, or X amount of countries updated their NDCs and whatnot. The Kingdom did update its NDC in 2022, was it? With the first Saudi Green Initiative, actually, 21. when we announced our net zero targets, but also our NDC. But it's important to distinguish between NDCs and net zero commitments, because NDCs have plans. Some of them are conditional, some of them are not. And by conditional, I mean certain countries receiving funding from other countries or support technology advancements. Also how countries industrialize. So there is like a asterisk that has these conditionalities, and some are unconditional. But then these do not, the net zero targets are not translated into NDCs. So they're different. NDCs, because you're committing to an international process, you're more conservative with your numbers. You're obviously more conservative with your commitments. That doesn't mean that countries are not committed to their net zero targets. It just means that they're still figuring out how to get there, and they can't really commit under the UNFCCC process to a net zero.
Yeah.
So let's turn to Saudi Arabia, and what this means for Saudi Arabia. It's Saudi Green Initiative, it's Middle East Green Initiative, its plans, because so much of the conversation is that these oil producing states, the Gulf states in particular, wanted to have, starting back in Glasgow, but also even very much so last year in Egypt, wanted to expand the conversation to abatement, and not just fossil fuels. Clearly, the UAE consensus reflects some success in doing this. But can you talk a little bit about Saudi Arabia going forward in terms, post COP28?
So just to clarify a few terminologies here, it's so what happened in Glasgow was the phase out or phase down of coal and phase down inefficient subsidies on fossil fuels. That was the first time fossil fuels were mentioned explicitly in a text, and it only referred to the subsidies on fossil fuel, and then explicitly singled out coal. This conversation was reopened in Sharm el-Sheikh last year, COP27, but it didn't really advance much. This year is where really the conversation advanced on fossil fuel and integrating the term fossil fuel when it came to phasing down or phasing out, which ultimately resulted moving away from fossil fuels, which now, the final text says transitioning away from fossil fuels in our energy systems. But I'll let you, Mashael, talk about Saudi's perspective, and then I'll add on to that.
Yeah, I think from Saudi's perspective, to the point that Noura was making on NDCs prior, maybe there are some countries that are putting in their net zero goals and commitments, very few, but there are some that are putting it within the NDCs. But the way that Saudi Arabia chose to do it was to put on the NDCs whatever they were sure that they'll be able to commit on in parallel outside of the NDCs to the net zero goal and target by 2060. If we're drawing different parallels, the easiest to say within the global stocktake is the goal and target of tripling renewables and doubling of energy efficiency. What was the last number, Noura, on renewables? Is it
tripling?
No, what by 2024 it was.
Saudi Arabia, I think we'll have about 20-something gigawatts in under development. So arguably that was the easiest thing for Saudi Arabia to sign off on, because our starting point is so far and so low that we'll be able to achieve a exponential growth in our renewables, as well as some of the additional areas that we could be capturing on energy efficiency. So that's definitely in step with how we choose to approach it. Transitioning away, as I've sort of alluded to in the beginning, is something that's already happening organically around the world. Saudi has established 2 parallel programs, sister programs, I would say arguably in connection to the Ministry of Energy, but also with a lot of different counterparts in Kingdom, which are the Circular Carbon Economy National Program, as well as the Oil Sustainability Program. And the intention between the two is to ensure, I guess now with the signal that we're getting from the UAE consensus, is as you're increasing demand for your product, you have to start thinking about the associated emissions and how do you ensure that your product is very much fit for carbon management purposes, right? As the space starts to narrow down for what kind of barrels of oil are viable in this global market, as we're trying to meet our intended goals and targets, how do you ensure that the Saudi input into that process is becoming more fit for purpose? In addition to thinking of
all of the unlocking of technologies that have just received a very clear signal and endorsement from the exercise of the global stocktake, be it in the development of clean hydrogen. Saudi Arabia's very much chosen lens when it comes to the colors of hydrogen, agnostic, green, blue, yellow, pink, purple. All of them are fine under our umbrella, as long as we're looking at the carbon content in quite a serious way. And clean meaning, to take it even one step beyond the low carbon hydrogen umbrella. Equally, a very clear signal towards renewable, in addition and in parallel to what we're trying to achieve from a 50-50 goal and target for electricity generation from renewables and natural gas. And natural gas, now the mandate has been given and the signal has been given since last year that no new power plants will be built without carbon capture and sequestration. We saw the commitments for the 9 million tons CCUS hub that's already oversubscribed in Al Jubail. Where you're creating whole industries in Saudi Arabia.
And by the way, the 44 million tons by 2030, intended by 2030, is the biggest ever globally.
Mm-hmm. I mean, in parallel, the type of role that we're trying to take under AEON Collective is to try and understand, and this will definitely, the UAE consensus will send us into another round of reviews of that type of process, but to understand what's the innate value in early action and what could be captured from these types of movements if you're seeing it as a smooth transition as opposed to a need to meet certain requirements somewhere down the line. I think the opportunity there for Saudi Arabia is quite massive, be it from the renewable side, our ability to go into nuclear quite seriously. And this is something that we've seen over the last few weeks, a big ratchet up, equally in COP, an emphasis on renewables and nuclear as sources of energy, in addition to this massive emphasis on CCUS. I'm not sure if you're going to be around here in January, but there's also this Future Minerals Forum that's happening in Saudi on a yearly basis. So Saudi is slowly maturing to become the Saudi Arabia, not for oil, but the Saudi Arabia for energy as a whole ecosystem. And with it, the opportunity to create these positive spillovers into industry, the type of innovation that we want to create and harness within our boundaries, the types of opportunities that could be captured within carbon markets, the GHG, for example, crediting scheme that was announced during MENA Climate Week from the Ministry of Energy that would allow us to create tradable carbon credits from projects that would be deployed and developed in country, the regional voluntary carbon crediting market that is arguably quite successful to date and is starting to attract more and more people into it. The more that these conversations are focused around the integrity and the real inherent value for these carbon offsets, connecting it back to what type of inherent value you could be creating in country that's measurable, that's verifiable, that's quantifiable, becomes a really interesting space for conversation. And I guess in parallel, what I would also be focusing on is the type of capacities that need to be developed and deployed in country, the type of jobs that these types of signals are creating for the industry, not solely globally or at large, but equally within the kingdom, of what are these next areas of focus that we need to be energizing, sorry for the pun, throughout the in country. I don't know. Yeah.
And AEON Collective, I mean, because you were very closely involved in the MENA Climate Week in terms of the paper that came out afterwards, everything that went in and then everything that came out. And you're sort of at the heart of all this. And it is a fascinating time for Saudi Arabia and these choices. Carbon capture is not yet a proven technology at scale. There's questions. In other words, there's been failures to do it at scale. Saudi Arabia is moving forward. Hydrogen, yet green hydrogen may or may not be economic yet. So it's just fascinating the bets that are being placed globally, not just in Saudi Arabia. And I think so much of what COP28 in terms of technologies is emphasizing are directions that Saudi Arabia wants to go anyway.
I just did want to comment on something that you mentioned earlier on the scale of carbon capture technologies, and it's not proven at scale. And I do take an issue with that because the language matters. The way that these conversations and these topics are being communicated to the general public and the masses makes a difference. And I think the issue with carbon capture, just like other technologies that have not been developed at scale or not scaled, is that it takes time for the financing to be put in place, for you to figure out the business models, for the policy to come around to support these technologies to scale. To say that the technology is not proven is misguided, because the technology is proven. We've been doing it since the 70s, right? Without leakages, properly done. There's standards for carbon management and injecting them into aquifers and other spaces, or also mineralization, which is a lot better as well, like they're doing in Iceland. So I think the challenge here is really the financing and the policy space, that it's actually conducive for that. And I think with carbon markets opening up and being developed, with carbon pricing coming along globally, I think this will be, this hopefully will improve. But it's also important to notice that there's no one size fits all. There's no silver bullet that will save the problem, will save or solve the problem. Carbon capture is necessary, but is not the ultimate solution. And this is where the conversation is usually fraught. You know, pointing to oil and gas producers saying that they're trying to promote this technology because they want to maintain their product. And ultimately, it's a decision of governments. When governments make the right decision, put the right policies in place, that is, and the regulations and the regulatory requirements in order to ensure the integrity of all of that activities, that is really what's going to get us on the right path. And I think we are getting there. We are going there, and things are happening. But we do need all of the above. We need hydrogen. We need carbon capture. We need as many renewable energy deployment as possible in all shapes and forms. Energy efficiency is a low-hanging fruit. And maybe to mention one thing that was announced at the at COP was also something that Saudi Arabia and the UAE announced, was the global the oil and gas decarbonization pledge, which brought together, sorry?
For methane.
No, in general, decarbonizing and getting the industry to reach net zero. Methane was a big component. So managing methane, which is a low-hanging fruit, Saudi Arabia is known for its high standards when it comes to best practices in managing methane emissions, usually only used for routine flaring, which is necessary for safety reasons. But you get a lot of flaring globally, especially with, you know, let's not name names, but all over the world, methane is being flared and leaked, and that causes a huge damage. Methane is 80% more potent than CO2, and just managing methane alone can save us a lot of time as we figure out the more complex challenges of CO2 and managing CO2 in order to solve for the climate challenge.
You did mention MENA Climate Week, and I just want to tell you the way that we chose to approach it at AEON. You cannot give recommendations or send directions on what you don't know. And as an initial step, all of our actions have to be science-based and put the science first in terms of the approach. So what we chose to do with our collaborators going into the previous year, KAUST, and I definitely have clear respect and recognition for Professor Matt McCabe and KAPSARC as well, that went into it with Dr. Mohammed Hijazi. We said that we need to have a baseline that allowed us to understand what's at risk, and how do we look at this issue, not in silos, but in a holistic manner. And that resulted in a paper that you alluded to, which was the report titled Climate Futures, Impacts of a 3-Degree World on Saudi Arabia. And to me, I'm not biased to the chapter that I co-authored, but there's a very sobering page. We chose the color black as a backdrop of that page that showed you a graph of where we need to go, right? If you saw the gap between what we have in terms of commitments in our NDCs and between where we need to be to ensure that we're heading in a direction that allowed us to reach our net zero goals and targets by 2060, it was around, I think, 44, if I'm not mistaken. Tons, you can correct me, and feel free to put that graph up there as I'm having this conversation to people.
It's 2/3 of our renewable energy and energy efficiency commitments would get us around 2/3 of the way to meet our NDCs.
Yeah.
Everything else would come from probably nature-based solutions and other efforts.
But it's essentially we need a lot.
Still less than 1/3 of what we need to abate or avoid to reach our net zero target. So there's still a lot of things.
I remember that there was also, and this is very real for the region, there was also a very striking page about the impact of global climate change on Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, because it's even greater. It's even greater. So the urgency is we talk about the oceanics, and submerging countries in essence, but your region, the Middle East, is going to be hit very hard if things aren't done, even more so than the rest of the world.
Absolutely. I think specifically from a temperature increase perspective, we always have this conversation with some of our colleagues out there. We say that you want to keep 1.5 to stay alive. We definitely double down on that 1.5 goal and target, because that 1.5 almost translates into a 2-degree goal and target in our region. That already means that we're way above, we're offshooting that global initial really high level threshold goal and target. And why is it an issue in our region? And that's why it requires the granularity and the type of science that will be developed on the back end of it, is that because we are in a desert climate. And if you nerd out and dig in a little bit deeper into pressure zones in a desert-like climate, you would know that very little shifts in temperature averages would create massive climatic shifts. So with it, maybe uncertainty when it comes to some of the precipitation patterns, be it an increase of rainfall in some areas versus decrease. That's why we chose, when we did that report, to not only look at the impact from a model's perspective, but to understand its implications on health, its implications on energy and on infrastructure and industry, its implications on terrestrial and marine ecosystems. The Red Sea that we pride ourselves for having in our backyard, one of the most beautiful, most pristine, arguably most resilient seas in the world, is again not disconnected from what's happening around the globe. With the remembrance that our baseline might be quite high, but it's still our baseline and our threshold to which our environments and our ecosystems evolve to withstand. And these slight shifts have massive implications. So it requires a bit more of a nuanced way of looking at the science, understanding it quite deeply, and then understanding how that influences the socioeconomic pathways that we choose to take, but at the same time, not look at innovation and take it for granted as, if you pour enough money or throw enough money at a problem, thinking that will solve it in and of itself. It's a much more complex web of elements that you need to be controlling for to be able to create the shifts. And this requires enough of a runway to understand what's at stake, what is the science telling us, and how can we harness the power and the ingenuity of all of the society to help solve for these issues, to ensure that at the end of the day, we're being responsible actors in Saudi Arabia. We're not solely there to act on behalf of ourselves, but there on behalf of the rest of the world. And that requires, honestly, a healthy dose of humility and pragmatism being thrown into the equation, but ensuring that every step of it, you're putting the science first, and actual science, not politicized science, but actual science that's agnostic, that's informing you about whether or not you're on the right pathway.
I guess we unfortunately have to sort of wrap this up soon. I mean, we should just turn this, Richard, into a big series on, I mean, we could, because there's just so much I want to ask you guys, but I think a good way to conclude this is, this is the hottest year for Earth on record. You guys said that this COP sort of created a solid rule book. It was a natural evolution, and it's becoming what COPs need to be in years to come. And I think a skeptic of the process would say, this is taking too long. Greenhouse gas emissions are still rising. We're still planning, fossil fuel expansion. So we know that with cooperation, we can do this. But I want to ask you guys, do you think we will?
I think we have to, and I think we will. I think the less we talk, the more we act, the better it is for everyone. And I think Saudi Arabia is acting and taking the necessary steps. the movement that's happening around the official stream under the UNFCCC is really what's moving action, right? I think the UNFCCC and the process has been conducive and has done a lot over the years and is still doing a lot and is still necessary to accelerate action in ensuring strong governance from a global level and a unilateral kind of approach. Or unified approach. However, there's a lot of bilaterals and multilateral deals that are happening on the side that are actually moving things forward. And I think these are things that are going to move the discussion forward and are going to trickle down and have a positive spillover on the negotiations themselves. Because a lot of the challenges
were negotiated out.
Yeah, not that, but I think like not the challenge, but a lot of the apprehension surrounding the negotiations is because a lot of these things are not tried, have not been proven, they're not at scale, all of the above, right? But these bilateral conversations and agreements that are happening on the sidelines by civil society, by global business, by the financial institutions, they're figuring out things on the ground, and their success will trickle down onto the negotiations and allow the negotiation process to even propel further because they're seeing what's happening on the ground. And I think that was also a big space where the kingdom was able to play a proactive role in the negotiations because it has been doing things on the ground and actually moving forward its climate agenda and its environmental agenda as part of a comprehensive development agenda. So I think it's important to highlight that and the benefit that this informal track brings to the table.
But I think the bigger message, especially in climate discussions that we see, puts you in one of two camps, either that of punditry and trying to imagine and envision what that pathway will look like, and then start staring at pieces of paper and say, good enough, not good enough, bad, black, white. It just doesn't work that way. Or you choose to do what we're hopefully doing, which is roll up our sleeves, have a sobering look at the science, keep our North Star, at bay and ensure that we're heading in that direction of 1.5, and to say, this is what we choose to do, and this is where we choose to take ourselves over the next 10 years. To me and to Noura, both of us, it's not acceptable to think of these outcomes of any of these COPs as a win for Saudi Arabia and stare at the faces of our partners that will be on the losing end of it and say, well, we tried. Sorry. I wish we could have done more. It will definitely be our mission over the next few years to ensure that every single country has a clear seat at the table and has a clear and pragmatic way of engaging with the issues, less of dreaming up dreams on a piece of paper and more of things that could be deployed and are actionable. And you can think of it as our life's mission of ensuring that all of this progress is not only felt in Saudi Arabia, it's actually more in step of the ethos of Saudi Arabia, that no growth, no benefit comes to us without pulling our brethren along with us to a safer space of operation. That tends to be hopefully what our mission will be in the next few years.
Princess Mashael bint Saud Al Shalan and Princess Noura bint Turki Al Saud with AEON Strategy. Guys, thank you so much. Edifying for both of us and for all of our listeners and viewers to learn about COP28, COP29, the way forward, and your experiences there in the UAE. So thank you both very much.
Thank you, Lucian. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you both.
Yeah, and thank you for all the great work you're doing.